Walt the biggest citizen of the United States of America.
On December 8, 1941, Walt Disney received a phone call that would change everything. But it wasn't about a new movie. 500 armed soldiers were marching onto his studio lot at that very moment, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. Within hours, Disney's parking lots were packed with 3 million rounds of ammunition. His sound stages, the same ones where Snow White had come to life, were now filled with anti-aircraft guns. And Walt Disney, the man who'd built an empire on fairy tales and happy endings, was about to transform his beloved cartoon characters into weapons of war. This is the story of how Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and the entire Disney studio enlisted in World War II, and what they did might have changed the outcome of the war itself. But here's what makes this story truly shocking. Disney didn't volunteer for this mission. He was drowning. By 1941, the company was nearly bankrupt, crushed by a debt of $3 million to the Bank of America. Pinocchio and Fantasia, despite their artistic brilliance, had failed commercially because Hitler's armies had closed off Disney's European markets overnight. 45% of Disney's revenue gone. The bank had summoned Walt and his brother Roy to San Francisco and given them an ultimatum: slash costs immediately or we're shutting you down. Things got so desperate that Walt and Roy took 75% pay cuts just to keep the lights on. Then came the animators' strike. In May 1941, Disney's own employees turned against him. For 5 bitter weeks, picket lines surrounded the studio. The family atmosphere Walt had so carefully cultivated was shattered. Some of his best animators, the very people who'd helped create his magic, walked out and never came back. So when those soldiers arrived on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, Disney wasn't just occupied by the military, he was already defeated by circumstances. But what happened next would prove that sometimes your greatest weakness becomes your greatest strength. The Army wasn't there to make movies. They were protecting the nearby Lockheed plant, which was churning out P-38 fighters and Hudson bombers. But that same day, Disney got another call, this time from the Navy. They needed training films, 20 films on aircraft identification for $90,000. It wasn't much money, just $4,500 per film, when Disney usually commanded far higher rates. But Walt said yes immediately, not because he needed the money, though he desperately did, because he understood something profound. Cartoons could do what live-action films couldn't. They could make complex ideas simple. They could make people feel things. They could change minds. What followed was one of the most dramatic transformations in Hollywood history. By 1943, 90% of Disney's output was for the government. Not 90% of their revenue, 90% of everything they made. The studio that had produced 37,000 feet of film in its best pre-war year was now churning out 204,000 feet annually. They worked 7 days a week, 3 shifts a day. The workforce exploded from 550 employees to over 1,200. And the characters everyone loved, they were going to war. Donald Duck became the unlikely face of America's fighting spirit. Think about that for a moment. A hot-tempered, partially dressed duck with a voice nobody could understand became one of the most effective propaganda tools the United States had. Why Donald and not Mickey? Because Donald's rage felt real. His frustration felt earned. When Americans saw Donald struggling through boot camp and Donald gets drafted, released just 5 months after Pearl Harbor, they saw themselves. The film revealed Donald's middle name, Fauntleroy, and showed him failing his color blindness test, only to have the examiner declare, "Close enough." It was funny, but it was also true. That's how it really worked. For many Americans in 1942, Donald's cartoon was their first glimpse into what military life was actually like, before they'd heard from their own sons, husbands, or brothers serving overseas. But Donald's most important mission wasn't on the battlefield. It was in your living room. In January 1942, Disney released The New Spirit, a film about the most boring subject imaginable, paying your taxes. Except Disney made it thrilling. Donald hears on his radio that taxes will beat the Axis, and suddenly, filling out forms becomes a patriotic duty. A Gallup poll found that 37% of people who saw the film said it influenced them to file their taxes on time. Imagine that kind of conversion rate today. Donald appeared in at least 146 military unit insignias during the war, more than any other Disney character. Combat units wanted him because his fury matched their own. Mickey Mouse, meanwhile, appeared in only 37 insignias, and not a single one was for a combat unit. Mickey's nice guy image just didn't fit the reality of war, but it made him perfect for the home front, for war bonds, for keeping civilian morale high. Then Disney created something that would win an Academy Award and allegedly put Walt on Hitler's personal hit list. Der Führer's Face premiered on January 1st, 1943, and it was unlike anything anyone had seen. The film opened with a grotesque marching band, Tojo on sousaphone, Göring on piccolo, Goebbels on trombone, Mussolini on bass drum, and Himmler on snare. They parade through a nightmare version of Germany where every tree, every cloud, every building is shaped like a swastika. Then we see Donald Duck, dressed in a Nazi uniform, living under Hitler's regime. He's served coffee made from a single bean. His bread is so stale it requires a saw to cut. Instead of bacon and eggs, he gets a spray can labeled "Aroma of Bacon and Eggs." It's absurd, but it's devastating. Because Disney wasn't showing you the horror of the Holocaust, most Americans didn't know about it yet. He was showing you something just as powerful, the sheer misery of living under fascism. The film's centerpiece is brilliant and disturbing. Donald works in an artillery shell factory, screwing caps onto ammunition. But every few seconds, a portrait of Hitler passes by on the conveyor belt, and Donald must stop and salute. The pace increases, faster and faster. More shells, more Hitlers, more salutes. Donald's arms become a blur. He's screaming. He's breaking down. The shells themselves seem to be marching, stomping, crushing him. Then he wakes up. He's in his bed wearing star-spangled pajamas. It was all a nightmare. He embraces a small Statue of Liberty on his windowsill and shouts, "Am I glad to be a citizen of the United States of America?"
Am I glad to be a citizen of the United States of America?
The film ends with Hitler's face appearing on screen and a tomato smashing into it. The song became a massive hit. Spike Jonze's recording topped the charts. The film won the Oscar for Best Animated Short. It was so effective that, according to some accounts, Hitler was so enraged he added Walt Disney to his personal list of Americans to be dealt with after Nazi victory. We can't verify that claim with certainty, but the fact that it's even plausible tells you everything about the film's impact. But here's the twist. After the war ended, Disney buried the film. They refused to release it for decades because they were worried about showing Donald in a Nazi uniform, even in a satirical context. It didn't appear on home video until 2004, 61 years after it won the Oscar. That's how powerful and controversial it was. Now you might be wondering, was all this propaganda work profitable for Disney? Absolutely not. Walt deliberately provided most government work at cost, no profit margin, minimal overhead. Remember, the company was already drowning in debt. By the end of 1942, Disney's deficit had reached over $1.2 million. The financial strain was crushing. Walt would give rough cost estimates over the phone for rush projects, and when those estimates proved too low, the government held him to his word anyway. So why did he do it? Partly patriotism. Walt had served in World War I as a Red Cross ambulance driver, decorating his vehicle with cartoons to cheer up soldiers. He understood the power of images to lift spirits. But there's another reason. If it weren't for those government contracts, the Disney company might not exist today. The work kept his remaining staff employed when commercial film production had collapsed. It kept Disney's name in the public eye. It let them experiment with new techniques. And perhaps most importantly, it established Disney as more than an entertainment company. It became an American institution associated with fundamental values of freedom and democracy. The studio created over 1,200 military insignias during the war, all completely free of charge. They produced 400,000 feet of educational and training films. They made feature-length propaganda like Victory Through Air Power, which Walt personally financed because he believed so strongly in its message about strategic bombing. When Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt watched that film during the Quebec Conference, it reportedly influenced Allied bombing strategy. One scene in the film, showing a fictional rocket bomb destroying a German submarine pen, actually inspired the British to develop a real weapon, which they called the Disney bomb. By 1945, when the war finally ended, Disney had paid off its debt and was ready to return to entertainment. But the company had fundamentally changed. The characters had changed too. Donald's temper now carried echoes of righteous American fury. Mickey's wholesomeness was forever linked with home front values. They weren't just cartoon characters anymore. They were veterans. But we need to talk about the dark side of this story. Many of these propaganda films contained racial stereotypes that are deeply offensive today. Japanese soldiers in Commando Duck were portrayed as subhuman caricatures. These weren't just insensitive, they were dehumanizing, designed to make killing the enemy easier to accept. Disney has acknowledged this, stating that negative stereotypes were used as part of propaganda efforts and recognizing the harmful impact. This raises an uncomfortable question. When does patriotic messaging cross the line into hatred? When does making the enemy laughable become making them less than human? These are questions we still grapple with today. What Disney accomplished during World War II remains unprecedented. They proved that animation could move adult audiences to action on serious issues. They showed that beloved characters could serve purposes beyond entertainment without losing what made them special. They demonstrated that popular culture could be mobilized for national interest during crisis. The legacy continues. Many of those World War II insignias are still used by military units today. The bond between Disney and the armed forces remains strong, and the idea that entertainment companies have a responsibility to reflect American values. That started here in wartime when Mickey Mouse enlisted. This story matters because it reveals something fundamental about power in a democracy. The most effective weapons aren't always bullets or bombs. Sometimes they're the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we stand for. In World War II, America needed to believe it was fighting for something bigger than territory or revenge. It was fighting for freedom, for democracy, for a world where people could laugh and dream and create without fear. And who better to tell that story than a mouse who started with nothing but a dream and a duck who never backed down from a fight? 500 soldiers marched onto Walt Disney's lot on December 8, 1941. They came to protect a factory, but they ended up transforming an entertainment studio into one of America's most powerful weapons. A weapon that fought not with violence, but with imagination. That's the secret history of how Disney went to war. And in many ways, we're still living in the world that war created.